I'm Scott Brady. I'm the owner of Progressive Association Management, and thank you for the enjoying the Playbook podcast that we're happy to share with you and to give you tips and tools to be pick the best management company and be the best board you can. There's a pretty interesting statistic where less than 10% of boards self-manage, community self-manage. Mind you, there's 53,000 homeowner associations in California, and very few self-manage. But in residential, for example, over 65% of people who own residential property self-manage. So it's just the opposite. So why is that? Why is it so many boards are asking for professional association management services? Well, because for a lot of reasons. The first is it's far more complicated. So it used to be, back in the day when they started homeowner associations, they were kind of self-governed. They had these things called CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and you followed those. It was kind of their laws, if you will. And it was pretty simple. That changed a whole lot when the laws called the Davis-Sterling statutes were passed. And they were passed in the late 70s and then really became enforced in the 80s. And Davis-Sterling were two people, Gray Davis and a person named Sterling. And they realized it was kind of crazy out there in the HOA world. And after 1978, when Prop 13 passed, almost all new construction were homeowner associations because the cities didn't want the new communities on their balance sheet. They don't want to be responsible for the streets or the electricity or the landscaping because that became a liability, and said, hey, form your own association. That's a you problem, new community in our city. And an example would be Irvine and Mission Viejo. In virtually the entire city, every single development's a homeowner association. So the legislators thought, okay, we need to get involved because there's just some bad actors out there and boards not doing the right thing and who are abusing their power. Because when you look at an association, it's almost a purest form of government. Unlike California with 35 million people with a governor, and we have the assembly and the Senate. When you have a board, you have 5 board members, and that's your elected body. And they kind of run the show. Whether you're a community of 10 owners or 10,000 owners, you have 5 or 7 people that run your community, and they were kind of being abusive. They're picking on individual owners and not doing the right thing, and really there was no accountability. What could an owner do? Because that was the government. That was their little city, if you will. So when Davis-Sterling statutes passed, they created a number of laws and statutes and said, rather than everybody having their own rules and their own laws, if you will, this is codified. Because the way it works is the federal government rules the state governments rule the city governments then rule the associations. So if the state passes a law, whatever you have in the CC&Rs is no longer valid. It's no longer enforceable. The state law trumps. And to give a good example of that, we had a lot of associations that we want no rentals. We want 0% rentals. Well, the state didn't like that because they wanted people to rent property and they wanted to open up more housing. And the state about a few years ago said, the minimum level of rentals is 25%. So whatever's in your CC&Rs, if it says you can have 0, that trumps that. Now you have to allow 25% of your owners to keep them as rentals. So association management also, the reason why people don't do it themselves is you can't get paid. It's not illegal for a board to pay themselves, but if they do, their insurance is void. There's an insurance called directors and officers insurance. And if I'm sued by an owner because they don't like my decision making, I'm protected with this insurance. But if I'm paid, I don't get that insurance. So we manage almost 235 associations and not one board member receives compensation because they really want that insurance, because owners will sue and they want to make sure they're protected. So you can't get paid. Another great reason is, do you want to be the bad cop? Do you want to be sitting on a board and have to tell your neighbor that you're going to give them a fine, or you're going to put a lien on their property, or you're going to go to foreclosure because they haven't paid their dues in a long time, or you're going to restrict their use of the pool because they're late on their dues? Nobody wants to be that. Nobody wants to be the bad cop in their neighborhood. They'd rather have a third party come in and be the bad cop. So effectively, when you're hiring association management services, which, as I just told you, almost everybody does, here are the things we do to keep you in compliance with the Davis-Sterling statutes. There was a time, I've talked to an attorney in the business, and he used to recommend that if you were 100 owners or fewer, 10 years ago, you could self-manage. He now tells, he doesn't care if you have 10 owners, you shouldn't self-manage because of what I'm going to go through. So Davis-Sterling, what does it say? First of all, you have annual disclosure requirements. Every owner legally is entitled to certain documentation, because when you're an owner in an association, you're a member. You're liable for the liabilities of that association. Of course, you benefit from the assets as well. And when you have a homeowner association, their assets are really the common areas. So if you live in an association of townhomes, and the common areas are the pool and the tennis court, but the common areas could be the patios, common areas could be the roof, common area could be the walls. Well, the association, that's their assets. That's what they're protecting. And so the statute said, okay, well, great. We want to make sure the owners are aware of the financial condition and make sure the board is doing the right thing. So every year, the board must do a few things. One, the board must have a valid election. And there's all kinds of laws about what a valid election is. The board can't count the votes. The management company can't count the votes. A neutral third party has to count the votes. You have to notify that there's a call for an election. You have to have a call for candidates. You got to make sure that those candidates are valid. And then you got to have a legal election, count the ballots, and boom, that person, of course, is then elected or not elected to the board. Legal election. Because if you don't do that election properly, then any decisions that board makes, if it's not a valid board, are invalid. So an invalid board member is elected, and they decide to raise the dues, whatever. Then an owner discovers that it wasn't a valid election. Guess what? You can't raise the dues on them. They could petition the court and say that was an invalid increase. So you have to have valid elections. Very important. You have your annual disclosures, of course. And in that annual disclosure are a few very important things. Number one is the reserve study. So once again, by law, a board is required to do a reserve study annually. Every 3 years, the reserve study specialist has to go to the actual community, look around, look at the fences, look at the pool, look at the equipment, look at the roofs, and they do an in-person assessment. The other 2 years, they can do a desk assessment, so use what they did in person, and then kind of update it up on the desk. And what they're telling the community and the board, because the board has to give this to the owners, is here's what we think your liabilities are for the next 30 years. Here's when we think the roof is going to need to be replaced, and here much we think it's going to cost to replace that roof. So we think, this professional thinks in 10 years, your roof will need to be replaced, and the cost to replace that roof is going to be $2 million. So in 10 years, you need to have $2 million sitting in your reserve account for the roof. So if you only have $0 in the roof balance, you've got to collect $200,000 a year over 10 years, so you're prepared for that expense. If you already have money in the bank, you already have $1 million, well, you got to put $100,000 in that account, and that drives, of course, your reserve study drives your dues. Because if you're underfunded in your reserves, you got to increase the dues so you have adequate financing to affect these repairs and replacements. Because they're going to look at every single common area item. The roof, depending on, once again, what's covered in the common areas, which is shown in the CC&Rs that you're given when you buy the property. When you buy the property, you're given the CC&Rs, given the budget and bylaws, you're given all the articles of incorporation, and that runs with the land. But every year, of course, some of these things get updated, including the budget. The budget changes annually. So when you have the reserve study and it says, well, you're really well funded, you don't need to increase dues, you don't have to increase dues. But if the reserve study says you need funding for these items in the future, then the dues have to reflect that. So the board makes that decision what the dues increase will be annually based on the budget and the reserve study. And there are laws around how much they can increase the dues. By law, a board can increase the dues annually 20% during the course of the year without a vote of the members. So if the current dues are $400, the board can decide to increase the dues to $480 with no vote of the membership. They want to increase it $81, they have to have a vote of the membership. So that's one of the key things the board's doing annually is looking at the reserve study, looking at the budget, and then, of course, coming up with the dues. Now, what the management company does is guide them along that. What's interesting is that the association management company makes no decisions for the board. The board's in charge of the association. The association management company is not a voting member, but our job is to give them good counsel and to help them make good decisions. Ultimately, a board has one critical thing they must do. They must show good business judgment. The business judgment law or rule protects the board. What is the business judgment rule? Well, business judgment rule is very simple. As long as the board makes a decision that was based on a reasonable number of factors. So, for example, there was a famous case study, and the board won in this case study. A board had to do termite repairs on a community in San Diego. And they looked at 3 different termite companies and listened to the proposal. They looked at the cost. They looked at the reputation. They did all this investigation. They picked one of the companies. Well, it turned out the company they picked did a horrible job. They were incompetent. They didn't finish it. And they took the money and they ran. And some of the owners in that community sued the board for incompetence. And that went to the Supreme Court of California. And when they looked at this, said, look, the board made a bad decision. They picked the wrong vendor. But it's not as if they didn't try to pick the right vendor. They tried to show good business judgment. They did vet 3 vendors. And it just turned out they picked the wrong vendor. And they were not held personally liable for that. And that applies to everything a board does. So what we as a management company do, all management companies, try to help the board show good business judgment. Hire vendors that are licensed if necessary. Hire all vendors that are insured. Because if a board decides to pick the cheapest vendor who doesn't have insurance and they chop off their foot doing landscaping, well, they're going to sue the association and say, wait a minute, you hired me and you knew it, I didn't have insurance. So, that's why typically boards are, looking at 2 or 3 different bids for any kind of project they're doing. So they're not showing preferential treatment to one vendor. They're showing good business judgment. So part of that's a budget, of course. So the dues. Now, if they want to raise the dues, the reserve says that's not enough money, you're going to be out of money. Then the board can make the decision at their discretion to try to pass a special assessment. So I'll say they're underfunded, not because of their fault, but the previous boards thought it was their job to keep dues low, not to protect the assets of the corporation. Because a board member has a duty of care, fiduciary responsibility to the organization, a duty of loyalty. They have these corporate responsibilities. And but let's say the previous boards just thought their job was to keep dues low and be popular around the clubhouse. Well, they may say we need to do a special assessment. And a special assessment, then they would send it out, a vote to the entire community, and you have to have a majority. So 51% of the owners have to agree to assess themselves of whatever money the board thinks is necessary to effect that repair or that replacement. Could be $100,000, it could be $10,000. And the owners get to decide on that. If that doesn't pass, and there's really an emergency now, the community decided not to impose a special assessment upon themselves. Some owners won't do that, because let's say I'm living in a community and I don't use the pool or the tennis court, and they need $200,000 to effect immediate repairs because the pool's leaking, the tennis court's cracked, but I don't swim and I don't play in the tennis court, so I'm going to oppose that special assessment because I use that stuff. Even though, as an owner in a community, I'm liable for those two amenities, regardless if I use them or not. They're part of the common area, and I own my percentage of the common area. So if there's 100 owners, and I'm one owner in that community of 100, I own 1/100th of the asset and the liability. I'm an owner of that tennis court, even if I don't use it, and I'm responsible to pay for it. But let's say they don't pass a special assessment, then the board can say we want an emergency assessment because we have to effect these repairs. There's a risk to health and safety, and then the board on their own volition can impose an emergency assessment on the owners without a vote. Obviously, you're going to have an attorney involved to make sure it's an emergency assessment, everything done properly, the funds are used for those repairs they're going to do. But that's the other power the board has. As an owner, you really have 2 rights. It's important to understand this. You have the right to listen to these meetings, to attend the meetings, to discuss, to state your opinion at the beginning of the meeting, what your feeling is on this. That's it at the meeting. If you don't agree with the board does, you have one other right. You can run for the board. You can get elected, and you can change the course in the decision-making of the board. But always remember, that's only 1 vote out of either 3, 5, or 7. If the entire community is upset with the board, they think they've done something really wrong, then of course they can have a recall. And once again, the statute state very clearly what it takes to have a recall of the board. If you recall the board, you got to elect a new board. But here's the thing we found. We manage a lot of communities. Whatever issues the current board's facing, the future board's going to face. The numbers don't change. The reserve state doesn't change. The assets don't change. You still have the fiduciary responsibility to protect those assets. The other disclosures in the annual disclosure given to every owner by the board is the DEC page, insurance declaration page. That's what the limits are, what the deductible is. One of the toughest, one of the biggest bills a board has to pay is the insurance. And many of our communities, particularly townhomes and condos, if everything were to burn down, the insurance company has to rebuild everything. So that's a pretty expensive thing. And then, of course, they have general liability insurance as part of that. Somebody trips and falls, somebody gets bit by a dog, whatever it might be, they're going to sue the association again. So it's really important that an association have really ample coverage at reasonable deductibles. And so the board's always trying to find the best insurance at the lowest premium that gives the adequate coverage. Also in there, of course, are the rules and regulations that can change with the board notification. You get to see that if anything's changed on the rules and regulations of the community. So these are important documents that every owner receives annually. Don't throw them away if you live in an association. Keep them, because when you sell, you have to give those same documents to the buyer of your community. Some other things that the management company is going to make sure that the board stays in compliance with is if there's an audit, if the board collects more than $75,000 a year in annual dues, they have to have an annual audit. After the audit, they have to file tax returns. No, almost every HOA, every association we manage is a nonprofit, so they don't pay taxes if there's a quote-unquote profit. They take in more revenue than they spend, and that stays in the coffers of the association, but you still have to file tax returns. You have to file with the Secretary of State as a corporation every 2 years. That has to be done. And then the whole thing starts all over again. You go back into preparing for the budget, get the reserve study. Every once in a while, a new law will pop up. A few years ago, after a balcony collapsed in Berkeley on a rental property, the state legislature decided to impose a balcony inspection law so that if a community has balconies and they're part of the common area, which most usually they are, then they have to be inspected every 9 years. And if they're really in bad shape, they need to effect the repairs immediately. But regardless, they have to have a balcony inspection report on file that's given to the owners now. That's given to the owners when the balcony inspection is done, but it's also given to any buyer in that community at the time of sale. Eventually that might change even to annually to owners. So you have to have the balcony inspection done. So there's pretty much every month something has to be done. Most communities want the management company to do an on-site walk, meaning visit the property either once a month or once every 2 months. And the purpose of that on-site walk is not an inspection. Community managers aren't, they're not general contractors. But what they can do is look for violations. So there's obvious violations, and an owner has painted their balcony a wrong color, or they've got something hanging that shouldn't be hanging there, or they've just whatever. They're violating the rules and regulations of the community. Well, they're going to tell the owner, hey, they're going to do this inspection, immediately tell the owner if you need to correct this within 30 days, or you could face a fine. They're going to do that inspection to check the work of the vendors, particularly landscaping. So if you have a weekly landscaper attending, we want to make sure they're doing their job properly and report back to the board. So basically the community manager is kind of the local boots on the ground for the management company. They interact with the board. They keep them in compliance. They keep them on an annual calendar. They try to understand the community. They understand their vendors. It's nice to have a long relationship with that board and that community, because every community has its quirks and things that are unique about it. The last thing you want is have a new community manager every 3 months. You have to retrain like a dog. This is how things work here. Here's our rules and regulations. Here's what the idiosyncrasies of our properties are. So it's good to have a community manager that's there for a good long time. Community manager really also informs the board of keeping in compliance with, it's called Robert's Rules. So when you conduct a meeting, you don't want it to be the Wild West. So the community manager often will help the board conduct the meeting the right way. And what's the right way? So typically in a board meeting, there's an agenda by law that has to be posted within 4 days of the meeting. We try to do it within 5 days, but so be it, 4 days. And that agenda gets posted at the community so every owner can see what they're going to talk about. So let's say in that community, you're allowed to park on the streets overnight. And the board's decided we don't like that anymore. We want the streets to have no cars on the streets during overnight. And they are going to change the rules to state that. And if you park on the streets, you can get fined, or you can get your car can even get towed. Well, they're going to put that in the agenda. So then owners can show up and say, I'd like to park on the street. I bought in this community because I could park on the street. I don't want you to take that right away from me. And that can be an issue they can discuss publicly. And let's say in a community of 100, 50 show up and oppose that idea. The board might say, forget it. We're not going to do it. It's not worth the aggravation. And so the community manager will post the agenda. And then at the time of the meeting, typically an agenda, they all go a little differently. There's no law on what order it has to be in. But typically there's an executive meeting to start, which is private for the board and the community manager. And they're going to talk about fines. They're going to talk about any legal action against any owners. They're going to talk about whether the board, if somebody hasn't paid their dues in quite a while, should put a lien on the property. If they really haven't paid their dues in a long time and they're very delinquent, should we do a collection, send them collections, which is a nice way of saying foreclosure. If the board decides any of those things, one of the things a management company does is we have a collections department. So if an owner chooses not to pay their dues, they're going to get an intent to lien letter. Hey, you didn't pay your dues, and if you don't pay your dues soon, we have the ability to lien on your property, put a lien on your property. If they ignore that letter, then the board might vote to put an actual lien on the property. So if they were to sell, the board's protected because there's actually cloud on the title saying, hey, before this can close escrow, we want to get paid the money we're owed. And if they completely ignore that and they go in arrears at least $1,800, again, California statute, then the board can send them to collections, which is, again, a nice way of saying pre-foreclosure. And if they ignore that, and they ignore the collection process, and they really, the board can send somebody to foreclosure. And when it goes to foreclosure, they get paid off at that time. We're in a good market right now, so we're not having any of that going on. But that's a real threat to owners. When you live in an HOA, the bank doesn't know they can foreclose on you. The board can foreclose on you. The association can foreclose on you because when you're not paying your dues, they need that money. They need your dues money to put into reserves to pay for all the goodies that you're going to benefit from or your other owner is going to benefit from. So after the executive session, there's generally open session for the owners. So the owners can speak freely about anything, typically for 3 minutes. You can limit them. And they can talk about anything. They can talk about the hedges that aren't being pruned properly. They can talk about too many pets that are roaming the community. They can talk about something on the agenda they oppose or they support. They can talk about how a board member is not doing the right thing. They're allowed to say anything as long as it's not vitriolic and they're not threatening. But after that, they're done. It's a board meeting. It's not a homeowner meeting. The homeowners has a right to speak their mind, but after that, they're not entitled to debate with the board anymore. We have to educate boards all the time that once you close down the comments by the homeowners, it's time to do the board work. It's time to go to the agenda and let's go through what we're supposed to talk about. Oh, we're supposed to talk about landscaping and maybe entertaining a new landscaper and get 3 bids. And the community manager will have obtained for that board 3 bids. We'll talk about the 3 bids, and then the board doesn't discuss it with the homeowners. They decide which one they like, or maybe they want to keep their current landscaping company. Maybe there's a better landscaping company at a lower price. They might go with that. And the board votes. And how the board votes is there's typically a motion to be made. And if I'm the board, I make the motion to hire ABC Landscaping Company. And then I have to second. So somebody on the board has to agree with me that they want to do that. There's additional discussion by the board, and then there's a vote. And if the majority of the board votes to approve ABC Landscaping Company, that's it. ABC Landscaping Company wins it. If I make a motion to hire ABC DEF Landscaping and nobody supports me, that dies. So that's kind of the way the democracy runs at a board meeting. And they go through the whole agenda. And during this time, the community manager is taking minutes. Minutes are very important. This is a corporation. And the decision the corporation makes has to be memorialized in the minutes. So the minutes say, Scott Brady made a motion to hire ABC, Jessica Clayson seconded the motion, vote was made, a majority board, and these 3 people voted to hire ABC. That becomes part of and they never go away. We never destroy the minutes. Because if ever a lawsuit, somebody said, well, gee, they hired ABC Landscaping Company improperly because somebody who works there is related to somebody on the board. Well, this is how they would document the fact that they did vet the company. Here's how the voting went. So it documents everything the decisions the board makes. So the community manager takes those minutes down, types them out back at after the meeting, and at the next meeting, sometime in the future, the board signs off on those minutes. That's how important it is. The board has to say, yes, that's what we did at that meeting. That is correct. And that's the meeting. And then they conduct the meeting. They make sure everybody behaves. They make sure everybody gets their voice heard, and they close the meeting. So part of one of the job responsibilities of the community manager is how to really conduct a meeting. It's not taught in college, something you don't learn naturally, but it's an important skill to have because some people at a board meeting run roughshod over other board members. Some owners get out of control. And you want to have a meeting that does the business of the corporation. That's a productive meeting for everybody involved. And that's a lot of what the management company does. Keep in compliance, keep on a calendar, make sure they do the right thing, show good business judgment. We want to make sure our boards are protected legally from personal liability because they always follow the letter of the law. So let's talk about Progressive. So when I got in this business and I decided to start an association management company, here's what we found. There's a huge shift in the business about 3 or 5 years ago. So I got in the business 4 years ago. Right when I was getting in the business, there was this seismic shift going on in the industry. Well, what happened was salaries went way up. Minimum wages went way up. And so somebody who's a community manager making $30,000 or $40,000 for a small mom and pop company, local company, now by law had to get paid $50,000. Now it's actually $65,000. And they just didn't have the profit margin, these small mom and pop companies, and their kids didn't want to run this business because it's a tough business. Let's say it. When you deal with we manage 15,000 owners. So and let's say there's 2 people in every property. It's 30,000 people we have to interact with. And not just the 5 board members, but in 100 community, the other 95 owners. You've got a lot of people who've got a lot of opinions, who want a piece, who want to talk to you. And these smaller companies just couldn't pay the higher wages, and they just started going away. And then the mid-sized companies, the companies that didn't just manage in a small city or a local, they kind of managed more of a region, they started getting bought up. There's a big trend throughout the United States, just not association management. It's called roll-ups. So you have a lot of money out there, private equity. It's not stock market money. It's people with billions of dollars. And they look at certain industries, they say, if we could buy up rather than having 50 companies in 50 states, if we bought all the 50 companies and created one big company, well, there's efficiencies there, and we could be much more powerful in our marketing, and we could have a much stronger brand. And so in a lot of industries, many industries, you've had these roll-ups. Rental business, you name it, ice storage, you name the business, there's somebody out there trying to buy a lot of the companies. Well, that happened in association management. A lot of money came into the space, and they started buying the mid-sized companies, saying, hey, we'll pay you much more than you even thought it was worth. And we'll take over your company. And so now we're used to have probably in, let's call it Southern California, we don't manage in San Diego, but call it Los Angeles, Riverside, Orange County. Where one time there was, let's call it 500 companies, there's now 50. They've just either gone out of business or they've been gobbled up. And so when we got in the space, what was interesting is that these big companies, they might be big, but they don't do better association management. In fact, if they're going to pay a community manager $80,000, they expect them to manage 3 times their income annually. So let's think you're a board, your community, and your management fee is $1,500. Well, they need them to manage, 20 of your communities, right? They need them to manage $30,000 a month. Well, imagine 20 communities with 100 owners. That's 2,000 owners. That's 4,000 people. That's 20 boards. That could be 100 board members. And it just became intolerable. So what you found was that the service levels really were not good. You look at the Yelp reviews and the Google reviews, the majority of management companies. They just have community managers that are overworked, and they need to overwork them because they have a lot of overhead. They got to pay back that person they borrowed money from. They've got a lot of corporate overhead. They've got a beautiful building in Irvine. They've got executives being paid lots and lots of money, and it has to be borne by somebody, so it's a community manager. The other thing they did in order, once again, to create revenue is they started feeing these associations where once it was just a management fee. You paid $1,500 and that was it. Well, now you had a vendor fee. You had this fee, a paper fee, a postage fee, access fee, all these different things. So your base management fee all of a sudden went from $1,500, but when you added up all the additional fees, it was $2,500. And what they in my opinion, trying to do is give you fewer options. If they're all the same, if now there are only 10 companies in Southern California, you really don't have much of a choice. So we decided when we got into space that we were going to create a better business model. And we had come from the residential side, from residential property management. where we were hiring real estate agents to be property managers, and they were our boots on the ground. They knew the tenant and the owner, and they did the lease up, and they did the evictions if necessary, and they coordinated vendors. We said, you know what? People love that model. Our owners love the fact that they get this higher level of customer service. I don't need to make the profit margin of these big companies with these huge overheads. This is a family-owned business. I own the company. I have for 12 years for the residential, for 4 years with the association management side. My son one day will take over the business. I probably get a call at least once a week to sell the business, and that's not going to happen because we like making a difference in the industry. We think that we can provide that superior customer service that boards are longing for with this business model. So we limit them. The other thing we decided to do is offer some guarantees. We were hearing that an owner would call a community manager and not get a response for weeks. Board members would not be heard from for days. And so we feel like that if we promise to provide that superior customer service, we should be held accountable. So we return all owner calls, emails, whatever, within 48 hours. We expect the board to be returned within 24 hours by a community manager or somebody here at the company. We make sure that we guarantee the work of the vendors. We don't pay until the board signs off on it. We now offer a HOA snapshot report. It's kind of a Carfax for HOAs to help boards make better decisions. The board always has my email, not my phone number, but they can always email me with concerns they have with any department at the company, with any community manager. And so we really try to stay connected to our boards. So we offered performance guarantees. And really what we just try to do is say, people want superior customer service. They don't want to work with the biggest company. They really want to work with the best company. And we strive on a daily basis to promise, deliver, and document superior customer service. And we take that earnestly. We care about our reviews. I think we have almost 300 five-star Google reviews now for association management. It's pretty hard to do. We really focus on that. We survey our boards every year on how we're doing, how can we improve. We offer board director success seminars, and we bring in board members, sometimes 90 to 100 here at this office, and we have an attorney come in, a reserve study specialist, an insurance specialist come in to educate our board members to make them better what they do. Because nobody teaches you to be a board member in college for the most part. You've got to learn on the go. So we want to help them do that. So we try to, as a company, help our board members make good decisions, improve their communities, because when you make the right decisions as a board member, you charge the right amount of money for dues. You take care of those repairs in a timely fashion or make those replacements in a timely fashion. It's been shown that you improve the values of those properties. You do a great service to your owners. The properties are worth more. They can sell more quickly because you took care of the common areas. You did the right things. So our job is to be good stewards with our boards of their communities and to care about the service we provide, to care about the communities we manage, care about the owners and what their opinions are, to stay connected. So I didn't know I was going to love the business as much because, of course, everybody told me, don't do this. It's just a lot of people who are going to yell at you. And I said, well, is it the people or is it maybe the frustration they feel with the management they're getting? And I think I learned it's a little mixed. There are some difficult people. I'm not going to take that away. But for the most part, they just felt they were being neglected by their boards or their management companies, and they blame the boards for hiring the wrong management company. If they're this bad board, why don't you get a new management company? So we aggressively go out there to communicate to the all the associations in Southern California. You don't have to live with the devil, you don't have to live with bad customer service with a mediocre management company. That we're out there to provide a higher level of service and a higher standard in the industry. So we live by that. We care about that. And I'm not going away. My son's certainly not going away. And we're here to really set a standard of excellence in Southern California for association management services.